Hey friends, today we're talking about sample size, appropriate sample size for your research, and they're going to kind of diverge here. I'm going to start out with Q-U-A-L, qualitative sample size, and then I'll go into quantitative, which will apply to much more of you in just a second here. And I include a site, you can see the address there. We'll spend some time talking about that. So qual, because of the nature of qual, we typically have a much smaller sample size. In fact, with qual and case studies are very similar in that they might have, as few as just 1, 2, or 3 people in the sample, right? For qual, I would always default to a round number of, say, 5, right? If you're doing a single case study, of course, then you've just got 1 participant. But in qual, anywhere from 5 to 10 is optimal. But I would say start at 5 and see if you need any more than that. And the reason why with qual, we're not looking for a wide breadth of knowledge, but rather a very strong depth of knowledge, right? So we're only going to have a few participants, but we're going to go really deep with what we're talking about with them, as opposed to having 1,000 participants and only getting superficial data across the board like this that you might do in quant, right? So a couple of things you want to consider about with qual is, one, how small is the population, right? So if you're looking at, trying to think of a good example, prison inmates is a good example, right? So prison inmates who have been convicted of a certain crime. Let's say you want to see how gang violence impacts young men who are released from prison. What you want to do is you want to find a sample of people who are in prison for some sort of gang-related violent offense, and then interview them afterwards, right? So we're talking about a smaller proportion of the U.S. population, an even smaller proportion of the prison population. So in this case, just a few are going to be sufficient. If you're talking about college-age females, then of course the sample is ginormous. So you might not want to go qual unless you're talking about a very specific subset. With qual too, let me go ahead and throw it out there. The most important part of a qualitative research design is who the participants are, or who are the participants? Question mark. Who are the participants? Because with qual, since you're only using a very small sample, you want to make sure you're speaking to people who have the information to address your research questions in an informed way, right? So you can't just randomly select people. You really want it to be much more what's referred to as purposive sampling, in that you're saying, okay, you have experienced this, and you have too, you know what this feels like, so the 3 of you come talk to me, right? You want to have informed participants. So we're going for quality rather than quantity. Ooh, qualitative, quality, anyway, whatever. With quant is a different animal. With quant, it's almost like speed dating, right? I don't care to know, as a quantitative researcher, most of mine is quant, right? As a quantitative researcher, I don't want to know every detail of every participant's life. I don't have time for that. I want you to answer these 20 questions and move on, right? So you're just getting a superficial perspective from, say, 100 people, 200 people, 500 people, whatever, right? So you have to figure out, okay, what is the appropriate sample size that I need for my research? I'm going to give you the short version, like the easy, straightforward version, but then I'm also going to provide this as a resource in case you want to explore this further, right? So first of all, how many participants you need has to do with how many conditions or research groups you have, right? So, for example, let's say I'm doing research on the effect of coffee on test taking. And I want a group of people who will take a test without having coffee in their system, and another group of people that will take the same test but have coffee in their system, right? In that case, I have 2 conditions, no coffee and coffee. I want to make sure that I have enough participants in both conditions to be able to provide good conclusions when I compare the 2, right? So in this case, I haven't necessarily doubled the number of participants I need, but I have increased it, right? Because you have to have an appropriate number in each one. So you might say, if I only had 1 condition, I might say, okay, I can have, say, 50 participants. Well, in this case, I probably need 50 and 50, right? Or before I might have said, with 1 condition, I just need 80 participants, right? Well, now I've got 2 separate groups, 2 separate conditions, so 50 and 50 would be much more appropriate. Now my overall sample is up to 100, right? So you got to keep that in mind. If I wanted to take a step further and say, okay, what about people who don't drink coffee is 1 condition, people who drink a tall is another condition, people who drink a grande is a 3rd condition, and then people who drink a venti is going to be a 4th condition. So now I've got 4 separate subgroups, right? 100 participants probably isn't going to cut it, because now that gives me only 25 in each. So I might have to go up to, say, 40 participants in each group. Now that puts me up to a total of 160 participants, right? So the argument that I want to make is the number of conditions you have really dictates how many participants you really need. Beyond that, okay, so that's only going to apply to some of you. Beyond that, I would start at 100. No matter what study you're doing, if you're doing a quant study, start at 100. 100 should be the minimum that you're trying to achieve. It's gospel, all right? So start at 100, but I would say start there. You hear me saying start that, not as aim for 100, but start there. That's where you want as a minimum, right? So I always tell participants, I tell students that participants are like money, right? How much is enough? I don't know. You could always have more, right? If somebody said, hey, how much money do you need to be happy, right? You might say, 10 million. No, 100 million. Make it a billion, right? Participants are the same way. So when we go to decide how many participants we need, especially in a thesis study, I would say a good thesis study that is quantitative will have no fewer than 100 participants. This is particularly true if your participants are undergraduate college students. Because, and no offense to my undergrads, but they're a dime a dozen. There's tons of them out there. Even at HCU, there are a ton of students here, right? And this is Houston. I mean, in Houston, we've got HCU, U of H, HCC, Lone Star. There are any number of, there are thousands and thousands of undergraduates here that you might sample. So in that case, you have a readily available sample, sometimes referred to as a convenient sample. You've heard that term before, I'm sure. Basically, we want to maximize it. We want the biggest sample we can possibly get. So what I would plan for is aiming for at least 100. That's the starting point. But, closer to 200, closer to 300 would be ideal. It will make your life easier, your data analysis better, if you could manage to go larger. And one of the things to point out is when you go to do this sampling, you want to make sure that you leave yourself enough time. If you only budget a week to do your sampling, you might only get 102 participants. But if you leave yourself 2 weeks, you might get 150, 170, right? So make sure you have the appropriate amount of time. The other side of this, I want to point this out. As we saw last week, I think it was last week, this is me pointing to the past, the lecture on SurveyMonkey. You might look on SurveyMonkey and say, oh, good, I've got 110 participants. But we don't know if that was 110 that completed the full instrument, right? So kind of keep that in mind, too. We always want to buffer. If you're aiming for at least 100, that means you have to have probably at least 120 people click on your link based on an attrition rate that would be expected for that, right? Having said all that, that's all. Believe it or not, that was the short version. Okay, the longer version, if you really want to go into the weeds about this, and typically this is going to be more associated with professionally done research or doctorate level research. It's not as much of a factor with thesis research based on the relatively small size of the study. But you can also find a sample size calculator, and there's the web address at the top there, should you need it. Right? And what it does, using this, it allows you to decide what confidence level you want, what margin of error you want, and the population of the proportion. The proportion of the population, right? So, for example, right, like at HCU, let's say we got 4,000 students, right? And we want no fewer than 400 participants, right? So we're looking to get 10% of the population, and we've got 4,000 students-ish, right? What it's going to tell me is if we want to be able to, like if we have access to 10% of the population, and we want to be have a 95% confidence level and a 5% margin of error, we need to sample around 134 participants. Okay? This, by the way, is kind of where we would be, right? These are fairly realistic numbers. What I would suggest, by the way, if we look at the portion of the population, if you're not sure, right, as it says on there, use 50% if you're not sure. If you don't know what portion of the population you have access to, as in this case, notice how the number jumps like crazy, right? It more than doubled when we changed that calculation there. So I'll put it back to 10% just so you're aware. You see it as it looks like this, right? So this is kind of where you want to be for HCU if you're sampling from our school. Notice, by the way, we want a 95% confidence level. This 95% confidence level is associated with our 0.05 significance level, right? So if you think of 95%, the flip side of that is 5%, 0.05. We want our p-value to be 0.05, which means we need a 95% confidence level. So what I would suggest, if I was calculating this, I wouldn't mess with this top number. Wouldn't touch it if I was trying to calculate this. I might mess with this second one, right? and set it a little bit more. We can have more margin of error, but notice how I changed the margin of error from 5% to 10%, and the number dropped by almost 100. Right? So I'll put it back up, right? So let's say, no, we got to be precise here. We want 5% margin of error, right? Our sample size, that was 35 with a 10% margin of error, now jumps like crazy to 134 with a 5% margin of error. And the reason why I'm showing this to you is, depending on how accurate you want to be and where you want to be in terms of precision, it makes a massive difference on how many participants you should sample, excuse me. But realistically, if you're going strictly by the sample size calculator with a population, with a student, or rather a sample from HCU, 134 is the number you should be aiming for. By the numbers, 134 is the number you need to have as a minimum, right? As a minimum. And that would give you the 95% confidence level and the 5% margin of error, plus or minus, right? So you see there's a complex aspect of this that is part of a larger research perspective. But as I said, if you start with the 100 and go from there, you'll be in a good place to make sure you get appropriate data to analyze your research, with the exception that if you have more than one condition, you have to start to consider that in terms of increasing your sample size.